think in a way the COVID experience sums up the problem, because by any rational standards, Scotland hasn't done very well in COVID. We've got a very high number of deaths. We have no obvious economic plan. We have huge questions to be answered that go unanswered, and yet we have these very high approval ratings for the way it's been handled. And it's a paradox which really does defy rational explanation. So the irrational explanations are: one is that there is a nationalist base, whatever it is, 40%, maybe a wee bit less, maybe a wee bit more at any given time, that no matter, you know, you're supposing half of Scotland was laid low with COVID-19, that they would still say a wonderful job's being done. So, you know, you have that immovable block, which distorts the numbers. And the second thing is that where they benefit, obviously, is they benefit by comparison. And I think everyone has to face up to that even when they're doing the same thing, they do it with a different accent. When they're doing a different thing, it's not necessarily better. But the contrast between this facade of assuredness and what's coming out of Whitehall much of the time, it works very much in their favour. So these two factors create numbers which are, as I say, irrational in normal terms. But that's going to unravel a bit. That there's an awful lot of people in Scotland who've got very good reason, sometimes very sad reason, to be looking for answers to why it did all go so badly wrong.
I don't despair about these polls. Polls go up and polls go down, and they can move very quickly. Trends are more important in polls than individual polls. And what is perhaps concerning is that these panel-based polls seem to be indicating a trend. Whether or not that pertains in other polls, and there's a trend overall, I'll be interested to see what Sir John Curtis has to say in the future. But if they are correct, then polls can also serve a useful function in such circumstances by telling people to waken up, to take it seriously, to start putting their hands in their pockets, to start getting out and campaigning. If they care dearly enough about something and the polls upset them, if they scare them, then really they need to waken up and do something about it. In some regards, though, I must say that looking at the current situation, I do actually think that there's much to be optimistic about. And that's partly because I actually feel with organisations such as Scotland Matters and many others, those that believe Scotland's place in the United Kingdom is good for Scotland and should be preserved, are much better organised, are much more willing to speak out, and aren't just connected to parties. They're quite independent of parties. There is more activism and more willingness to get things done and to save Scotland's position in the UK than there was certainly before 2014. So I think there are the foundations of what could be a strong campaign that could win, were there to be a referendum. The weakness in all of this is continually, of course, that the unionist parties, if we could call them that, very small u, tend to fight each other far more effectively than they fight the SNP. And this will obviously come up in further questions, but that's why people keep saying, should there be more coordination between the parties? Should parties only stand one candidate? Should voters vote tactically, and so on? It's because the parties cannot manage so far to do any of those things that people say, what can we do? Well, what they can do is, I think, certainly support organisations like yours and the others that are about in the meantime, until, as Brian Wilson says, normal service is resumed and we begin to see what ordinary politics may bring up. And at that point, we might be able to make some further judgments.
Like Brian Monteith, I'm not pessimistic about the outcome of a referendum if there was to be one. And both the strength and weakness of that argument is that there's not going to be one anytime soon. That gives time.
Yeah.
But as Brian says, that if the trend is in the wrong direction, then maybe what you're doing is postponing rather than negating the outcome that we don't want to we don't want to see. So I think you then have to separate the two questions of the election and the referendum. The significance of the election is that if there is a nationalist majority after the election, then it just continues the same sort of type of very destructive politics, drawing along constitutional lines, and other issues will be neglected in the future as in the past. So it is important that the other parties, the parties who do not want to see another referendum, do not want to see independence, are able to block that through not through the intervention of Westminster, but through the 2021 Holyrood elections. Is that possible? Yeah, I'm sure it's possible. But as you say, it needs the opposition parties at Holyrood to up their game a very great deal. And it does need leadership. And it does need to get away from the agenda of the Constitution. If it is fought on the Constitution and the Nationalists only need 40% to win a majority of seats, then that's exactly what they'll get. So it has to be moved on to education, onto health, onto the economy, onto all the devolved areas where the record is mediocre, to put it generously. It's not easy to do, but it certainly needs leadership to do, and I think that's where the parties have to question themselves, is whether they're giving that leadership and whether they are setting out attractive policies at the present time. I think by and large the answer to that is that they're not, and they have to look at themselves in the mirror and how to see how they can up their own game. Personally, maybe I disagree a wee bit with Brian on this. I don't think it's on to say you work together, you create a sort of unionist front. I certainly don't define myself first and foremost as a unionist. I didn't come into politics to be a unionist. I'm very much in the business of defending the entity within which I live, but I do so in order to advance my kind of politics, just as Brian would seek to advance his kind of politics. But to say that you can make a common front based on that one common factor is more likely to repel than to attract many voters. And if you gave people the chance, from my perspective, of voting for a Labour candidate who's aligned with other non-nationalist parties, or voting for the Nationalist Party in these circumstances, then I think you'd get a very uncertain answer.
I actually don't think I was really arguing for a common front. What I was trying to allude to is the fact that a lot of people keep asking about this and saying, why isn't there one? And of course, Brian Wilson's quite right. There is a great difficulty, and let's be frank, the leaders of the main political small U unionist parties know this. That difficulty is that if they say we're going to try and work together, they'll just basically, Labour people will be called red Tories and so on and so forth, and Labour votes might just melt away to the SNP. And the same, just as the way Liberal Democrat votes were lost wholesale after going into coalition with David Cameron. So there are real risks for these parties in being too close to each other. They do have to set out their stall and say this is what's important. And so I come round to the issue that what is important is in fact that every party really looks seriously at the issues of education, health and jobs, and really makes the most of that. In particular, we really have to face up to, and it's not being done in Whitehall or Edinburgh at the moment, we do have to face up to the real prospect of possibly the worst recession enveloping the whole of the UK that any of us have ever known or in fact know it in our lifetimes. It could be that bad. The prospects of a V economic recovery where it just bounces straight back up, I think are fairly slim. In which case, we will be going into an election with probably the worst unemployment figures, the greatest degree of shock to people's incomes, and suddenly confronted with real poverty than anyone has known. And that will be a different landscape from the landscape we have now. And you know, we will have to say, well, why has it come to this? Did the Scottish Government have any plan for economic recovery? Did it hold back on leaving the lockdown too late, and it's made the economic recovery worse? We know what the SNP answer will be. It will be, we need more powers. We you know, it's all England's fault, and we need more powers to save ourselves. And so the Unionist parties, small u again, really need to have a Get Scotland Working campaign, which talks about the real issues that will be confronting people, and that will be their jobs and their incomes. And that will be related to education and health, because those impact on getting your jobs. You can't go back to work if you've not got the childcare, for instance, or people going to school. So these policies, like Brian suggests, of the real political issues are what are going to win the Holyrood elections.
Essentially, Labour wasted a decade by choosing the wrong leader on at least two occasions, and the more they did that, the more they drifted away from electability, and that was exacerbated in Scotland, because more obviously in Scotland there was somewhere else for these voters to go. Now, my own belief is that that there is still a large reservoir of potential Labour support which has been alienated from Labour by its unelectability and by the direction it's gone in, but which is capable of being brought back if there's credible leadership. I now think there's credible leadership in the UK, and I think there are, you know, good promising signs. It's, you know, for me who's no longer active but who's still obviously strongly Labour supporting. I mean, it's great that you can turn on the radio, and the likelihood is that the shadow cabinet person who comes on will make you feel quite proud rather than hide behind the sofa. But I mean, is the same true in Scotland yet? I mean, I fling out the question without necessarily offering the answer. You know, but if it isn't, then people have to take a hard look at themselves. I mean, you know, at the moment, if you look at the polls in Scotland, Labour is heading straight for the precipice. Does anybody really want to lead it over the precipice? I mean, that's a question that, you know, folk are going to have to look in the mirror very soon and ask themselves. But I think there is, you know, I think Ian Murray's doing a really good job. I think Starmer's doing a really good job. I was really pleased to see Jackie Baillie coming back. I mean, there is, you know, there is still life in it. But unless there is a very clear agenda, a very clear leadership, and a credibility. I mean, what Labour does come down, and there were a couple of people previously who led Labour at Holyrood who were decent people, but the question is, could people see them as a First Minister? And if you can't see them in that role, then it's unlikely that enough people are going to vote for them. So I by no means, you know, I think there's a great responsibility on Labour in Scotland to look at itself and see how electable or how unelectable it's going to be next May. I think there is an opportunity now to lay out a very distinctive platform of what should be done. You asked me what I would do. Well, what I would have done over the past couple of months was not to set up yet another board. I mean, is there any corner of Edinburgh that doesn't have an advisory board meeting in it? But to ask 50 people, let's say, cutting edge of Scottish business and industry, what 10 things could we do to help that's going to make a difference over the next 6 months? Please send in your suggestions. Distill the best of them, and you'd actually have some actions to do. Instead of that, you've got a 77-page report that tells you absolutely nothing you didn't know already.
The ideas need to focus on jobs. That is going to be the landscape. And what will happen is that the SNP will be saying, we just don't have the powers to do anything. We need more powers. This is the answer to more jobs. Meanwhile, you can stay unemployed because we can't figure out what to do. The truth is there's lots of powers available, but in fact, the priority for the SNP has been to change the spending in the budgets to things that they think will advance the cause of independence, not to improve education, not to improve health, not to improve transport infrastructure or anything else, but to find them more friends, make more allies, and make more people dependent on their spending decisions. So in truth, they could find funding within their current budget. They have a huge underspend every year, remember. They could find funding to actually articulate ideas and changes in how we do things in Scotland so that jobs can be created, entrepreneurs can come forward, set up businesses and so on. They have those powers, and that needs to be said because it means changing the spending priorities that they have, of having all these things that are projecting independence abroad, for instance, which when there's a dire recession on is not important to people in Scotland. That's an example. But to give you an example of what they may do in the sense of big ideas, well, the landscape is that we are half out, half in the EU, and probably by the end of the EU, the year will be fully out in the sense that we've gone through the transition period. I'm not going to get too technical about that, but what it does mean is that some of the what people like I would claim are potential benefits can be realised, but they are not going to be proposed by the SNP because they don't want to talk about any possibility of benefits. But were we to use the opportunity to onshore manufacturing through the creation of freeports in areas of deprivation, potential deprivation, like Prestwick, or successful areas such as Grangemouth, Rosyth, then we can actually have areas where manufacturing can expand, jobs can be created, and the wealth that comes out of people having money in their pockets can then, of course, support other businesses. So there are things that can be done and that parties can suggest, and that doesn't mean that these businesses that might locate in freeports can't be unionised. Of course, they can be unionised. You can have all the various regulations that you might want to set up for them, but they can come in and they assemble goods, and these are then exported. It's a way of attracting work and jobs, and they're all over the world. But Scotland somehow is resistant to this idea because it's connected to another political issue. So there are ideas that I think can be made to work that will actually help create jobs, and that's going to be the biggest issue by this time next year.
In the same vein as what Brian said, for years we've been told that the reason that none of the work, it's absolute scandal how little of the manufacturing benefit has come to Scotland from renewable energy. And it's always, we must go through EU procurement processes. Well, if we're not in the EU, we don't have to go through EU procurement processes. So just as in the early 1970s when North Sea oil came on, but through the leverage that government used, not with any legislative powers, but with leverage, they took from 0 to 70% through the Offshore Supplies Office, the domestic content in the North Sea. Now, you've got this massive potential benefit of floating wind, offshore wind. As things stand, and given this sort of complete lack of planning for this, you'll be lucky if you get 5% of that staying in Scotland. Now, if you had an intervention as government which said, right, frankly, you're not getting the consents unless you manufacture here, then you could jack that up. But before you do that, there's no point in saying it could be done here when it can't be done here. And the investment has not been put in just until now in order to create the infrastructure which would allow the jobs to follow. So there's something entirely practical. It's been signalled for years. It's now a matter of great urgency. Cut through the bureaucracy, cut through the planning procedures and all the rest of it, put emergency legislation through, put investment in to create the infrastructure which really could create tens of thousands of jobs in renewable energy within a very short space of time. Is there the slightest sign of that happening? No, there is not. There will be more and more excuses about why it cannot be done. And there should be a dynamism just now about what can be done to meet a very urgent situation. but our expectations have been lowered to such an extent that nobody demands that of government. Setting up an advisory board and you take laps of honour for doing it. They come back with a report that says nothing. The guy stands up at the podium and he gets another lap of honour for saying nothing. I mean, it is low expectation. And for people of my generation who were, were ministers, who were challenged, were criticised, it is so frustrating to see people who are delivering nothing being held to account to such a marginal degree by the Scottish media and indeed by political opponents.
I struggle to understand why the opposition parties do not make more advances. And at times I can only conclude it is there are too many politicians, elected politicians, who actually should not be in politics, who really are essentially, I don't know if they're in it for themselves or if they prefer to have a job as effectively what becomes a social worker, dealing with the correspondence of sorting out everybody's problems and in handling bureaucracy, whether it's to get benefits or to get planning agreements or whatever. But how many of the politicians and you see sitting in Holyrood actually are making political points, coming up with ideas, proselytizing the future of a vision? And it's so sadly lacking. And there's a dearth of think tanks in Scotland. I mean, nobody wants to come up with ideas. And I entirely appreciate and agree with Brian Wilson that you have to deal with the practicalities. It is the laws of the land that you have to work with. And when those laws change, you then work with these new laws. And yet, how often do you hear the Conservative Party, or any other party for that matter, talking about the opportunities that will come for the changes that will undoubtedly happen with new fishery agreements? There will be new fishery agreements. There has to be. They won't just pass on seamlessly. And as a result, there will be opportunities in processing, landing, all sorts of things that could come to Scotland. Yet, never mind the government not talking about it, the opposition parties are hardly talking about it. So there are ideas that could be brought into effect that could create jobs. We cannot rely on the idea that parties that are not supporting independence will somehow skip along the road, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, we're all going to be in this together, because that's not going to happen. The opposition parties have to be opposition parties. They have to say, here's our vision. We see things differently. But they do have to focus, not on independence. They have to focus on what they would do. They have to focus on education in particular, I think, because I think it's an absolute scandal how that is being conducted under John Swinney and his predecessors. But more so, the landscape will be people needing jobs. And so those are the sort of issues that the politicians in these opposition parties will have to focus on, and not focus on whether they're for or against a referendum. I used to be of the school of actually saying, bring an independence referendum on. I used to say this in the 90s. Can we get this out the road? Because we really need to have good government in Scotland. And this constant idea that we can solve everything by independence needs to be put away. And it was delayed and delayed and delayed. And until I still thought we could even have one in 2007 as a 300-year mark of the Union and its success. But still, no, politicians said, no, we must avoid it. Well, it came about and we got through narrowly. I believe we'll get through the next one, because I think people will see that it is sensible for Scotland to be in the UK. But we must in the Holyrood elections not focus on that, but focus on education and jobs. Those are the things that will win any party support, not whether there's going to be another referendum.
I think from the other political perspective, I want to get back to arguing with Brian Monteith rather than agreeing on things, because we have two different interpretations. And politics in Scotland used to be conducted with respect. They were intense, but they were respectful. Now they are turgid and they are disrespectful. and anyone who holds a counter view to the prevailing orthodoxy is really driven out of the mainstream of debate. It's government by clique and by coterie, you know, and it's a very ineffective form of government. So we can keep making these arguments. I think it is essential that we do, that we don't get drawn into that. To me, the most the saddest thing I think that's happened in my political lifetime or recent lifetime is that the debate in that Scottish politics is now around flags. You know, an artificial division has been created, you know, on the basis of the constitutional divide, and that's not what politics is about. It's not what the dynamic of politics should be about. The dynamic of politics should be about those who have and those who have not. It should be a battle of ideas about how you improve society for everyone. It should be about recognising that the interests of people, the class interests, if you want to put it that way, of people in Glasgow and Liverpool and London are very similar. And on the other side of the divide, you know, the economic solutions, which would come from a right perspective, are as applicable in Scotland as they are anywhere else in the UK. That is what politics is about. And inch by inch, you go forward, you go backwards, but basically society goes forward. If society is bogged down in this constant constitutional debate in which everything, the only hope of progress, and it's an illusory hope, is through constitutional change, then you never get progress, because you're always looking for the populist middle ground, and essentially that the dynamic is changed to such an extent that the avenue to progress is blocked off. And that's what we see now. We see it in education. We see it in the lack of ideas for the economy. We just see it in the general rhetoric and tone of Scottish political debate. Now, how you can synthesize that into a compelling argument from either right or left perspective between now and next May, I'm not very sure, but I'm sure we've got to try.